Imagine walking into a luxury Mediterranean resort right now.
Right, like stepping right off the street.
Yeah, exactly. But the clothes hanging in the closets are from 1974. And down the street, there's a car dealership with brand new vintage vehicles they're just rusting in the display windows.
Tires completely flat, I imagine.
Oh, completely flat. You're standing in this massive, sprawling city, but there isn't a single human being around.
It's an incredibly eerie image.
It really is. And, usually when we look at a city skyline, we have this expectation of absolute permanence. We pour millions of tons of concrete, we lay the stone, and we just assume we've built a permanent geographical feature.
But that's not always the case, is it?
Not at all. So today, you and I are opening up a massive archive of modern ruins to figure out why entire cities vanish overnight. Welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We've got this fascinating stack of architectural history, environmental sociology, and urban planning documents. And our mission isn't just to look at creepy ghost towns, right? We want to read these abandoned places as material archives that record the rise and fall of human ambition.
And that illusion of permanence is, it's exactly what makes these spaces so compelling to study. Because ruins are not just static anomalies.
Right. They aren't just mistakes.
Exactly. They aren't just engineering mistakes. They are highly dynamic mirrors. They reflect the incredible fragility of the socioeconomic and geopolitical systems that are, constantly humming right beneath our feet.
Just completely invisible to us most of the time.
Basically, yeah. A city only exists because of a delicate web of resources, politics, and ecology. And the moment one of those invisible systems fails, the concrete crumbles surprisingly fast.
It's so true. I want to start by looking at places that were built entirely to ride an economic wave. We're talking about settlements whose entire existence was tied to a single commodity.
Like a massive gold rush town.
Yeah, exactly like that. I was reading through the research on Kolmanskop in Namibia, and the scale of it is just mind-blowing. Okay, let's unpack this. This was a German imperial diamond town built in the hyper-arid Namib desert in the early 1900s.
And it wasn't just a basic mining camp, right?
No, not at all. They built this opulent European town right in the sand. I mean, they had a casino, a bowling alley, a theater with acoustically optimized architecture.
Wow. In the middle of the desert.
Yeah. And they even had a dedicated plant that delivered free blocks of ice to every resident's doorstep every single day.
Which is staggering when you consider the logistics of maintaining a daily ice delivery in one of the most hostile, dry environments on the planet.
It's completely absurd.
It is. But that manufactured luxury was strictly for the colonial elite. It was built on top of a highly regimented and brutal hierarchy.
Right. The laborers had a very different experience.
A completely different world. While the administrators lived in electrified villas, over 800 contracted Ovambo laborers were confined to basic barracks. The underlying structure of the town wasn't really about luxury at all.
It was about extraction.
Extraction and intense surveillance.
Yeah, the surveillance aspect really jumped out at me in the source material. I was reading the medical logs, and Kolmanskop's hospital actually had the very first diagnostic X-ray machine in the entire southern hemisphere.
And I'm guessing it wasn't for broken bones.
Far from it.
Right. The primary function of that state-of-the-art medical equipment was to perform end-of-shift skeletal imaging on the laborers.
Wait, they X-rayed them every day?
Routinely, yes. They were X-rayed to ensure no one had swallowed any diamonds. The entire infrastructure of the town, from the hospital to the ice plant, was funded by this single finite resource.
And finite is the key word there, right? Because after World War I, the diamond deposits started to run thin. Bigger, more easily accessible deposits were discovered further south, and the money just evaporated.
So everyone just left.
Everyone just left. By 1956, Kolmanskop was totally empty. Today, the desert has literally swallowed it. The sources have these surreal photos of massive sand dunes pouring through doorways and filling up these ornate classical German parlors.
Nature taking it back.
Exactly. But Kolmanskop died because they physically ran out of the resource. What really caught my attention was Humberstone, Chile, where the resource was still in the ground, but the town died anyway.
Ah, right. Humberstone is a perfect example of a town killed by a laboratory experiment halfway across the world.
It's such a wild concept.
It really is. It was built in the hostile Atacama Desert to mine sodium nitrate, which was known as white gold. It was an essential ingredient for both agricultural fertilizer and military explosives.
So highly valuable.
Incredibly valuable. But the labor conditions were incredibly harsh, which sparked intense labor movements. Our historical sources detail a tragic massacre in 1907 where Chilean military forces killed a heavily contested number of protesting miners.
But the strikes didn't empty the town. Science did.
Precisely. In the early 20th century, German scientists developed the Haber-Bosch process.
The chemical process.
Right. They figured out a mechanism to synthesize ammonia by essentially pulling nitrogen directly out of the air. The moment that chemical process was scaled up, naturally mined saltpeter became economically obsolete overnight.
Wow.
Yeah, Humberstone's entire reason for existing was erased by a chemical patent.
It's like these company towns are taken to a fatal extreme. It's like building an entire civilization on top of a single finite battery. Once the juice is gone, the whole thing just goes dark.
That's a great analogy.
And if we look at Hashima Island in Japan, it's like the most compressed version of that battery imaginable.
Oh, absolutely. Hashima really pushes the limits of human settlement. It's this tiny island off the coast of Nagasaki bought by Mitsubishi in 1890 to mine subsea coal.
Coal that was under the ocean floor, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
To maximize the extraction, engineers completely enclosed the island in a massive concrete seawall to protect it from typhoons. And then they built Japan's earliest reinforced concrete high-rises.
I saw the photos. It looks like a concrete battleship.
It really does. By 1959, this 16-acre rock hit the highest recorded population density on Earth. Over 5,000 people crammed into a space the size of a few city blocks.
The descriptions of the architecture are just so claustrophobic. Sunlight was a rare luxury because apartment blocks, like the famous Block 30, were packed so tightly together that the alleys felt like shadowed canyons.
Just zero personal space.
Zero. But the sources also detail a deeply controversial history here. And while we aren't taking a geopolitical stance today, we do need to note that the historical record provided in the text explicitly details the conditions during World War II.
Yes. The archival material notes that between 1939 and 1945, the undersea mines were utilized as sites of brutal forced labor.
Right, just reporting what's in the texts here.
Right. The ambient temperature down on those shafts reached up to 40 degrees Celsius with 95% humidity. Records estimate around 1,300 conscripted Chinese and Korean laborers died on the island from accidents, sheer exhaustion, and malnutrition.
It's incredibly bleak.
It is. Today, Hashima is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, though the sources highlight that this status remains a subject of intense global dispute due to its wartime history.
Which makes sense. And ultimately, it suffered the exact same economic fate as Humberstone. In the 1960s, Japan's national energy policy shifted from coal to petroleum.
So the battery died.
The battery died. The coal was no longer needed, so in 1974, Mitsubishi simply ordered a complete civilian evacuation. 3 months later, the most densely populated place on Earth was a ghost town, left to rot in the ocean.
Which brings us to a really fascinating pivot. We've looked at settlements abandoned because the economic logic collapsed.
Right.
But what happens to the geography of a place when the resources and the economy are perfectly fine, but invisible political lines are suddenly drawn right through the living room, forcing an entire population to vanish?
The geopolitics of enforced vacancy. This brings us back to that luxury resort I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive, Varosha, in Cyprus. Before 1974, Varosha was the ultimate Mediterranean destination. We're talking high-rise, luxury hotels on pristine beaches, international celebrities, massive economic wealth.
A total paradise.
But during the 1974 Cyprus conflict, the island was militarily divided. The Greek Cypriot population fled the district, reportedly thinking they'd be back in their homes in a matter of days.
But they never returned.
Never.
The Turkish military fenced off the entire 6-square-kilometer district. So for 46 years, it sat behind barbed wire as a decaying time capsule. And looking at the texts covering this, it's a highly sensitive geopolitical friction point.
Right. And just to be clear to the listener, we are merely summarizing the diplomatic gridlock described in the literature here. We're not taking sides.
Exactly. But essentially, the UN and the EU have historically condemned any attempts to settle the area.
Yet the status quo is physically shifting right now. In 2020, Turkish Cypriot authorities initiated a phased reopening of Varosha, primarily for day-use tourists.
Day-use tourists in a militarized zone.
Yeah. They cleared sections of the beach and opened up a main thoroughfare called Democracy Avenue. By 2023, the sources note that a Turkish Cypriot businessman actually purchased 3 of those abandoned hotels: the Clio, the Golden Seaside, and the Aegean.
Purchased them from who?
Directly from their displaced original Greek Cypriot owners, with the stated goal of turning them back into functioning resorts.
Oh. And this is all happening parallel to a massive bureaucratic mechanism called the Immovable Property Commission, or the IPC.
Right, the compensation group.
Yeah, the IPC was set up to handle compensation claims for these displaced owners. Our documents indicate that by late 2025, they had paid out roughly £450 million sterling in compensation.
That is a massive amount of money.
It is. However, Southern Cypriot officials largely dismissed this commission, viewing the payouts and the reopening as a strategy to permanently partition the island.
I have to push back a bit on the reality of the tourism aspect here, though. I mean, the sources describe people renting bicycles and casually riding down designated asphalt corridors in Varosha to gawk at crumbling hotels and abandoned living rooms.
Right, treating it like a museum.
Yeah, but if you are vacationing inside a militarized zone created by mass displacement, aren't you just consuming someone else's unresolved trauma as a leisure activity?
Well, that is the fundamental critique of dark tourism. You are walking through the physical manifestation of an active, unresolved conflict.
It's just weird.
It's inherently voyeuristic and uncomfortable. But this kind of enforced vacancy isn't entirely new. We see a similar, though much older, demographic erasure in Kayaköy, Turkey.
Oh, right, the stone village.
Right. It was once a prosperous Greek Orthodox town, but the 1923 Lausanne Treaty mandated a compulsory population exchange entirely based on religion. The Greek inhabitants were exiled overnight.
But what's interesting there is why it stayed empty. The Muslim populations who were relocated from Greece didn't want to live in Kayaköy.
Because the architecture didn't match their economy.
Exactly. Kayaköy was full of steep, terraced stone houses built into the hillside. But these incoming populations were pastoral. They needed flat valley floors for their livestock, so they simply abandoned the town.
The architecture itself rejected the new inhabitants.
It totally did.
The physical structure couldn't adapt to a new function. Though there are incredible instances where isolated, abandoned spaces foster entirely new, resilient societies.
Like where?
Take Spinalonga, which is a rocky islet off the coast of Crete. Originally a Venetian military fortress, the state repurposed it in 1903 into a mandatory leper colony.
Oh, wow.
In its early decades, it was a place of systemic erasure and squalor. Patients were exiled there, and their personal assets were seized by the state.
It was essentially a waiting room for death.
Basically. But then the narrative completely flips. In 1936, a law student named Epaminondas Remondakis was diagnosed and sent to the island. He organized the residents and founded the Brotherhood of the Sick.
Wait, he unionized the leper colony?
He essentially did. They refused to just waste away. They literally rebuilt society within the ruins of the fortress. They whitewashed the decaying stone, built a theater, installed a working generator, and opened shops.
That is amazing.
They manufactured a highly functional, dignified community out of total exile. They stayed there until a cure for leprosy was widely available, and the island was finally abandoned in 1962.
Spinalonga proves that human adaptation can sometimes radically outlast the original purpose of the architecture. But if we shift our focus from politics and economics, we find that some of the most dramatic, instantaneous abandonments happen when our own attempts to bend nature to our will catastrophically backfire.
Anthropogenic catastrophes, basically engineering our own ruin.
Exactly. This brings us to Craco in southern Italy. Craco is this stunning medieval hilltop town that sat safely on a ridge overlooking a river valley for centuries.
Centuries without issue.
Right. Now, the locals always knew the geology was incredibly fragile. The town was built on deep layers of Pliocene clay and sand. To manage this, for hundreds of years, they used traditional cisterns.
Which is a crucial engineering detail. Traditional cisterns merely collect surface rainwater, keeping it safely contained and preventing it from soaking deeply into the porous earth.
Exactly. But in the mid-20th century, municipal authorities decided they needed to modernize the infrastructure. So they installed a massive high-pressure underground water pipe system. Okay, let's unpack this.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's like trying to install a state-of-the-art engine in a classic car, only to realize the sheer vibrations completely shattered the chassis.
That's spot on. Because the mechanics of the failure were slow but devastating. Those pressurized pipes inevitably leaked deep underground.
Into the clay.
Into the clay. The persistent water saturated the Pliocene clay beneath the town. And clay, when wet, becomes incredibly slick.
Right.
The leaking pipes effectively lubricated the subterranean friction planes, triggering massive, unstoppable landslides. By 1963, the sheer weight of the modernized infrastructure caused the town to slide off its own foundation, and it was declared utterly unfit for human habitation.
It's tragic because it was entirely preventable. And that very same year, 1963, Italy saw an even more catastrophic engineering failure up north, the Vajont Dam.
Oh, the Vajont Dam.
Ugh.
It was a marvel of ambition, a 262-meter-high hydroelectric dam. But the engineers willfully ignored glaring geological warnings that the adjacent mountain, Mount Talcott, was highly unstable.
They just ignored it.
Pretty much. During the initial filling of the dam's reservoir, the rising water destabilized the base of the mountain. A 260 million cubic meter section of rock sheared off and plunged directly into the reservoir.
The physics of this are terrifying. The sources say the rock slide hit the water at 110 kilometers per hour.
Yeah, the sheer kinetic energy displaced 50 million cubic meters of water in an instant. It created a 250-meter-high mega tsunami that completely overtopped the dam and funneled down the narrow gorge, obliterating downstream villages like Longarone.
Just wiping them off the map.
Completely. Around 2,000 people were killed in a matter of minutes. The tragedy was so profound that it birthed an entirely new scientific discipline, engineering geology, to ensure we never blindly build on unstable land again.
While Vajont was instantaneous, I was really struck by the story of Moynak in Uzbekistan, which is the exact opposite. It's a slow-motion ecological disaster.
The Aral Sea.
Yeah. Moynak used to be a bustling, prosperous port city sitting right on the Aral Sea, which was once the fourth largest lake in the entire world. But in the 1960s, Soviet planners decided to divert the massive rivers that fed the sea.
To grow cotton, of all things.
Right. They wanted to use the water to irrigate sprawling cotton monocultures out in the desert.
And the diversion effectively starved the sea of its lifeblood. Evaporation far outpaced the incoming water. By the 1980s, the Aral Sea had lost over 90% of its volume.
That is hard to even conceptualize.
It really is. The shoreline rapidly receded, eventually leaving the port city of Moynak stranded in the desert, 150 kilometers away from any water.
When you hear about Soviet planners draining an entire sea, it sounds like a distant historical blunder. But you have to wonder for a second, what massive, seemingly brilliant infrastructure projects are we building right now that are quietly triggering similar ecological domino effects for you and me?
It's a sobering thought.
And the imagery of Moynak today is haunting. It's a desert outpost famous for its ship graveyard. Just these rusted skeletal hulls of massive fishing trawlers just sitting in the dry sand. And it gets worse, because the exposed seabed isn't just sand.
No, it's highly toxic.
Right. It's a dry crust composed of decades of concentrated agricultural pesticides and heavy metals.
Which introduces a secondary crisis. The wind whips those toxic particles up into massive dust storms, causing severe respiratory and health issues for the local Kayaköy population.
Which is just devastating.
It is. To combat this, they are currently planting millions of saxaul trees directly onto the dry seabed. The root systems of these hardy desert shrubs help anchor the toxic soil, attempting to create a green shield against the lethal dust.
It's an incredible attempt to engineer a fix to an engineered disaster. And you really can't talk about anthropogenic disasters without mentioning Pripyat in Ukraine.
Chernobyl.
Exactly. Built in 1970 as a Soviet Atomograd, it was a model city housing 49,000 workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It had modern apartments, wide avenues, an amusement park. Then, the April 1986 meltdown of reactor number 4 occurred.
And the authorities infamously delayed the civilian evacuation for 36 hours while radiation blanketed the city.
Right.
When the 30-kilometer exclusion zone was finally established, the entire population was permanently relocated. In the decades since, Pripyat became a paradoxical laboratory. Because humans were absent, wildlife surged back. The concrete roofs began collapsing under the weight of winter snows and aggressive vegetation.
But that fragile post-human ecosystem was completely shattered again during the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022.
Yes. Russian forces actually captured the exclusion zone, utilizing it as a strategic military corridor. Today, long after their withdrawal, our sources indicate the area is heavily militarized, laced with landmines and tripwires to prevent incursions from the nearby Belarusian border.
So no one is going back there anytime soon?
No. All scientific and dark tourism has been suspended indefinitely. It transformed from a technological disaster site to a wildlife refuge, and now into an active military buffer zone.
Which bridges perfectly into our next category, We've talked about engineering failures, but what happens when regimes try to command not just engineering, but ideology?
Using architecture as propaganda.
Exactly. Totalitarian governments frequently use massive monumental architecture as physical propaganda. But when those regimes inevitably collapse, they leave behind these massive ideologically charged shells.
The architecture outlives the political system it was meant to glorify.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the Buzludzha monument in Bulgaria. Built in 1981, sitting at the very peak of a mountain in the Balkans, it was constructed to honor the Bulgarian communist movement.
And just looking at the photos in the source material, it's visually stunning.
Oh, it looks exactly like a massive brutalist concrete UFO that just landed on a mountain.
And the logistics of constructing it were staggering. They literally leveled the mountain peak using explosives, removing 15,000 cubic meters of rock just to create a flat foundation.
That's insane.
It cost the equivalent of $35 million at the time. To fund it, the state forced citizens to buy commemorative stamps. The interior was a cathedral to the ideology, featuring 510 square meters of painstakingly hand-laid cobalt glass mosaics.
But when the regime fell in 1989, the monument was completely abandoned. The copper roof was stripped by looters, and decades of brutal mountaintop winters froze and shattered the interior mosaics.
Leaving a massive ruin on a mountain.
Exactly. But fast forward to today, and we have a fascinating situation with the Buzludzha Project Foundation. They managed to secure funding from the Getty Foundation, and by 2022, they physically stabilized the interior mosaics to stop the decay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and now, in 2026, they're launching a massive multi-million leva project to secure the massive roof and replace the shattered windows to open it for public access.
Which touches on a deeply complex concept in preservation known as dissonant heritage.
Right. And again, just want to note that our geopolitical texts neutrally map out this debate without taking sides, exploring how nations grapple with preserving structures tied to oppressive pasts.
Exactly. Dissonant heritage is, well, it's a huge challenge for modern states.
It is. Basically, you're inheriting a massive, expensive building from a dark chapter of history and having no idea if fixing it means you're honoring history or celebrating a dictator. I have to ask, by spending millions to stabilize Buzludzha, is the modern Bulgarian government preserving architectural history, or are they accidentally validating the regime that built it?
That is the big question.
They even hold an annual open Buzludzha festival now, where visitors camp out, listen to live music, and volunteer to help conserve the mosaics.
It's a profound tension. How do you strip the propaganda from the concrete? You see a similar architectural overreach, though still in its original political context, with the Ryugyong Hotel in North Korea.
Oh, the pyramid.
Yes. Conceived during the Cold War in 1987 specifically to attract Western investment, it's a 105-story neo-futurist concrete pyramid towering over Pyongyang.
But construction abruptly halted in 1992 because of the severe economic crisis and famine that followed the collapse of their Soviet benefactors. So for 16 years, this towering behemoth just sat there as a naked, windowless concrete shell with a rusted construction crane stuck at the very top.
Right, just looming over the city. Ultimately, an Egyptian telecom firm, Orascom, was contracted to install a gleaming glass facade across the exterior in 2011.
So it looks finished from the outside?
From the outside, yes. But underneath that shiny exterior, the building remains a completely hollow, unpartitioned concrete frame. It was designed to hold 3,000 guest rooms, but there is zero demand, and engineers question its fundamental structural integrity.
So what do they do with it?
Today, it functions purely as a massive LED propaganda billboard on the skyline, an illusion of progress.
So we've got ruins created by boom and bust economics, drawn borders, geological disasters, and failed ideologies. So what does this all mean for you? You and I are living through a massive shift in how humanity processes failure.
Exactly.
Because instead of choosing between fully restoring these places or blowing them up, a new paradigm has emerged, curating the decay itself.
Urban planners call it controlled ruin. Authorities are literally monetizing spatial obsolescence. Take Beelitz-Heilstätten in Germany. It was a massive tuberculosis sanatorium that later served as a Soviet military hospital, finally abandoned in 1994.
And one of the central ruined buildings there, the Alpenhaus, had its roof completely destroyed by fire way back in 1945. Over the course of 60 years, an entire biologically diverse forest grew literally on top of the concrete roof structure.
The roots just wove into the masonry.
Yeah. So instead of tearing the building down, Developers built a 320-meter elevated treetop walkway suspended over the ruin.
It's a brilliant mechanism for preservation. The elevated walkway allows thousands of tourists to safely observe the decay from above without anyone actually stepping on the fragile, rotting floors.
It's like a museum of decay.
Exactly. We see a similar microeconomy of decay in Houtouwan, China. This was a fishing village on Shengshan Island, entirely abandoned by 2002, simply because the harbor was too shallow for modern shipping vessels, and it lacked basic roads or schools.
And nature took over.
Right. Because of the humid coastal climate, lush green ivy aggressively reclaimed the town, completely blanketing the brick houses.
It looks like something out of a fairy tale, which is why it went totally viral online in 2015. Tourists flooded into the remote area, physically threatening the unstable structures.
So the local government had to step in.
Yeah, they stepped in to manage the decay. Now, you pay a 50 yuan entrance fee. You are restricted to hiking along specifically reinforced concrete paths. And the most amazing part, former residents have actually returned to the village to work as tour guides and sell water.
That is fascinating.
Right. They created a highly functional microeconomy based entirely on managing the managed decay of their own former homes.
But it is crucial to note that not all ruins are commercialized for tourism. Some are subjected to strict permanent memorialization.
Like keeping it as a solemn site.
Exactly. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane in France is the prime example of this. On June 10, 1944, the Nazi Waffen-SS committed an atrocious massacre, murdering 642 residents.
Awful.
The men were executed in barns, and the women and children were locked inside the town church, which was then systematically destroyed.
And following the liberation of France, Charles de Gaulle issued a state decree that the scorched, ruined village must be left completely untouched, forever.
It serves as a stark reminder.
It is managed by the state as a solemn historical monument to the atrocities of World War II. It's kept incredibly quiet. They strictly enforce rules banning recreational vehicles, bicycles, and even pets to maintain an atmosphere of absolute reflection.
If we connect this all to the bigger picture, the geography of abandonment teaches us one vital lesson.
What's that?
Architecture grants us a powerful illusion of permanence. But the survival of our stone, our concrete, and our steel is entirely dependent on the incredibly fragile economic, geopolitical, and ecological systems humming beneath them. When those invisible systems fail, nature and time reclaim the physical space almost immediately.
It really makes you look out the window differently, which leaves you, the listener, with a brand new thought to mull over today. Think about how the massive shift to remote work is quietly emptying out sprawling downtown office grids in cities across the globe. Are we currently living and working inside the pre-ruins of tomorrow? Look around you. What ordinary piece of everyday infrastructure in your city right now will be a ticketed dark tourism site in 100 years?
It's a wild thing to consider.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious